It's really very much a pleasure to welcome Adam Hochschild back to P&P. This is at least Adam's sixth appearance in the store. The first was nearly 2 decades ago, and it seems the time between his visits keeps getting shorter and shorter. Between his initial talk here in 1990 and his second, there were 9 years that elapsed, then 6 years, then 5. His last appearance here was just 2 years ago. So at this rate, maybe we'll see you again next year. Adam has a great job. He just writes books about whatever interests him, and they tend to interest lots of readers, so he gets to do more books. His first jobs were in journalism. He reported for a daily newspaper for a couple of years, and that was good training, especially for writing quickly. Then he spent nearly a decade writing and editing magazines, including Ramparts and Mother Jones, which he helped establish. He thought he'd be a novelist, but his first try at that didn't go anywhere. So in 1986, he published a memoir, Half the Way Home, about his difficult relationship with his dad. And he's gone on since to produce books that can be categorized either as narrative histories or a combination of history and journalism. As he's explained elsewhere, Adam tends to be drawn to times and places in the past involving people wrestling with profound political and moral dilemmas and feeling an imperative to confront evil. He's written about apartheid in South Africa in The Mirror at Midnight, Stalin's prison camps in The Unquiet Ghost, the exploitative regime that King Leopold II of Belgium imposed on the Congo in King Leopold's Ghost, efforts to end slavery in the British Empire in Bury the Chains, resistance to the madness of the First World War in To End All Wars, and American volunteers and journalists getting caught up in the Spanish Civil War in Spain in Our Hearts. Whatever era or issue Adam has chosen to focus on, he's gone about telling the story through a network of connected, compelling characters. And his interest in situations where people have taken stands against despotism or unjust wars or institutional evils is rooted in his own coming of age and activism during the civil rights and anti-war protests of the 1960s. His new book, Lessons from a Dark Time and Other Essays, is, as the title indicates, a collection of pieces, all previously published. As Adam makes clear in the introduction, the book is meant to serve as a kind of response to the threat that Donald Trump's presidency poses to our democracy and to the resurgence of authoritarianism elsewhere in the world. A number of the essays are reminders that people have resisted racism, xenophobia, and other injustices in the past and won, helping to transform the world for the better and giving the rest of us continued reason to hope. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Adam Hochschild.
Well, thank you, Brad. It's very nice to be here. I remember that first time I was here in 1990. What I remember about it was that exactly 6 people came, 4 of whom were friends and relatives. So the trend is definitely upward, which is good. Well, it's very nice to have a chance to talk with you about my new book. I started thinking 3 or 4 years ago about this book that it would be nice to pull together some of the magazine pieces that I've written over the years for The New Yorker, the New York Review of Books, Harper's, Mother Jones, and other magazines. It would be fun to pull them together, polish them up a little bit, and put them in one volume. But then for the last 2 years, I've felt, as I'm sure a lot of you here have, that we are living in a pretty grim political moment. And that affected to some degree which articles I chose for this volume and how I framed them. Because to the extent I could, I wanted to choose, as Brad said, pieces that offered some hope or reminded us that we've been through grim times before and asked what lessons we could learn from them. And that's often what I'm thinking about when I write history. Now, this doesn't apply to all of the pieces in the book because there are some stories in it that I hope readers will enjoy even if they don't directly apply to the moment we're in. But it certainly applies to some of them. So tonight I thought I would just take you on a quick tour of a couple of parts of the book, which means a tour of some of my interests and obsessions. Not the full meal, which would be 26 courses because there are 26 pieces in this book, but a tasting menu of a few of them. So what are some of those lessons? What are some of the connections between the times we're living in now and parallel moments we can find in the past? I think sometimes when times seem dark, it is interesting to look back at times that were even worse. For instance, right now we have, as I don't need to tell you, a president who demonizes immigrants. Mexicans are rapists. There's this caravan of refugees who are approaching the border. They're now at the border, threatening everything we hold dear in this country, and so forth. And we think, looking at this stuff on TV, seeing it in the newspapers, this is a more naked and disgusting xenophobia than we've seen in the past. Well, let me introduce you to another president. Here is a quote from him, giving a speech to Congress. This is the quote. "There are citizens of the United States, I blush to admit, born under other flags, who have poured the poison of disloyalty into the very arteries of our national life. Such creatures of passion, disloyalty, and anarchy must be crushed out." The year 1915, the president, Woodrow Wilson. Now, we have a president today who calls the press the enemy of the American people, something that's echoed by his underlings on all sides. Have we been there before? We have been. Here's another quote. "There are some newspapers published in this city every day, the editors of which deserve conviction and execution for treason." The city that the speaker was referring to was New York. The year was 1917. The speaker was Elihu Root, at that time a special envoy of Woodrow Wilson, former Secretary of War, Secretary of State, United States Senator. Now, both of these quotes come from a period of severe repression that took place in the early 20th century, period from the spring of 1917 through early 1920. It was provoked by American entry into the First World War and then by the Russian Revolution. Paradoxically, it took place under President Wilson, somebody who is best remembered today for his internationalist idealism, for being the backer of the League of Nations, and so forth. And that time period, which has long fascinated me, and I've returned to it for a book I'm working on right now, is the subject of the title essay of this book, Lessons from a Dark Time. So before I get to the lessons, just to go over some of the things that happened during that period. With quotations like the one I just read to you, Wilson paved the way shamelessly for hysteria against immigrants. But the anti-immigrant crackdown that followed pronouncements by him and others was selective. When the United States entered the First World War, for example, the government used that as an excuse to arrest many Americans who were German-born but had never gotten, or I shouldn't say, many people in this country who were German-born but who had never gotten naturalized as U.S. citizens, even though they'd lived here for many years. But those arrests were highly selective. They just happened to pick people who belonged to the industrial workers of the world, the IWW, the country's most militant labor union. Repression of black Americans continued unabated in this era. There were 60 black Americans lynched in 1918, 78 in 1919, under a president who was an ardent segregationist and who actually tightened the amount of segregation in the federal government. But this period was so repressive that it was not just black people who got lynched, a number of whites as well. An IWW organizer in Butte, Montana, Frank Little, was lynched for having organized a strike of miners in protest against an underground mining accident that killed more than 100 copper miners. In Collinsville, Illinois, a man named Robert Prager, who had the bad luck to be German-born, was attacked by a mob, wrapped in an American flag, forced to sing the Star-Spangled Banner, lynched from a tree on the outskirts of town. It made no difference to people that he had actually tried to enlist in the U.S. Navy, but been turned down because he had a glass eye. 11 members of the lynch mob were acquitted of all charges by a jury, while a military band played outside the courthouse. And it's no accident that this same period saw an assault on the media unmatched by anything we've really seen in this country. Here, the excuse was the war, but the target was always the left. The government's instrument was the post office because newspapers and magazines had to reach people through the mail. They passed a regulation that said, and I'm quoting, "Anything calculated to cause insubordination, disloyalty, mutiny, or otherwise embarrass or hamper the government in conducting the war was banned from the press." Altogether, some 75 newspapers and magazines in this country either had entire issues censored, blocked from the mail, or were shut down completely. One of the magazines shut down completely was really one of the most interesting and lively magazines this country has ever produced, The Masses, which published John Reed, the young Walter Lippmann, Sherwood Anderson, Edna St. Vincent Millay, many other people. It was really the New Yorker of its day. One of the items that offended the censors in The Masses was a cartoon of the Liberty Bell crumbling. There was a massive crackdown on the labor movement. Radicals who spoke out against the war, against American participation in the First World War, were sent to jail. The labor and socialist leader Eugene V. Debs spoke out very strongly against the war after the United States had entered it. For this, he was arrested, tried, convicted, sent to prison, and he was still in prison 2 years later, November of 1920, when he received nearly 1 million votes for president on the Socialist Party ticket, campaigning from his jail cell in the federal penitentiary in Atlanta. Emma Goldman, the anarchist leader, sent to jail for 2 years for organizing against the mandatory draft. When she was put on trial and accused of being unpatriotic, she told the jury that her American patriotism was like that of the man who loves a woman with open eyes. He is enchanted by her beauty, yet he sees her faults. I think that's a pretty good definition of patriotism still today. And also in this era, we saw something that there's been a long, nasty thread of throughout American history, which was vigilante justice. Vigilantes broke into the office of a peace group right across the street from the White House, smashed its furniture, threw things out the window. They broke into a Socialist Party office on the Boston Common, made a bonfire out of its contents. There were vigilante groups that had names like the Knights of Liberty and the Sedition Slammers. The largest of them was something called the American Protective League, which ended up with 250,000 members, and was an official auxiliary of the Department of Justice. And these folks even had the franking privilege of sending mail for free. You know, when you get a letter from your member of Congress or a senator, all it requires is their signature. Same for the American Protective League. They made citizens' arrests. They beat people up. They generated more than 1 million pages of wildly unreliable accusations about subversion, so on, that got turned over to the government. They tarred and feathered people. And the period climaxed in late 1919, early 1920, in what are known as the Palmer Raids, after the Attorney General at the time, A. Mitchell Palmer, where they arrested radicals of every stripe all over the country. Altogether, well over 5,000 people arrested in a single day, January 2nd, 1920. One group of them were marched through downtown Boston in chains. May Day 1920, the Chicago police put 360 radicals in preventive detention for the day because it was said there was supposed to be a communist uprising on May Day, which never happened. So what lessons can we draw from all this? I think one of them is that sometimes a determined person in a position of some influence can still follow the law and have considerable influence. Here's an example from that period. During this period of the Palmer Raids, a total of somewhere between 6,000 and 10,000 undocumented non-citizens were arrested. And Attorney General Palmer and his young assistant, J. Edgar Hoover, were extremely eager to deport them. But the Justice Department did not control deportations. That was controlled by the Immigration Bureau, which fell under the Department of Labor. And there happened to be an Assistant Secretary of Labor, a man named Louis F. Post, former newspaperman, who was able to stop most deportations, a real hero of this grim era. He canceled search warrants, he restored habeas corpus rights for people who were detained, drastically reduced or eliminated bail for many of them. This earned him the undying hatred of Hoover, who unsuccessfully orchestrated a campaign by the American Legion to get Post dismissed, and when that didn't work, tried to get Congress to impeach him. But Post was able to keep his position, and all told was able to prevent some 3,000 people from being deported. Now today, a right-winger might call this the deep state in action. But whatever you call it, I think it shows that even in very dark times, sometimes our institutions still work. And I have a gut feeling that a lot of those institutions are stronger today than they were 100 years ago. I think the next 2 years is going to tell us whether that feeling is right or not. A second lesson I take from this era is that we have to be wary in this country of the way that tradition of vigilante justice may surface. We don't have anything on the scale of the American Protective League now, and I find it hard to imagine that happening. But we have seen a tremendous rise in the number of private armed militias around the country. You know, these are the people you saw last year at Charlottesville in their camouflage outfits, carrying their rifles in their boots and so on. And we've seen a lot of them in the West in these standoffs over Western land occupations. 400 armed militiamen on hand at one in Nevada in 2014, 300 in Oregon in 2016. In a 4-year period starting in 2010, there were more than 50 attacks on Bureau of Land Management or Forest Service employees, several of them by snipers. Under Trump, the number of armed militia groups in the U.S. has risen. The Southern Poverty Law Center tracks this kind of thing very, very closely, from 165 at the end of 2016 to 273 at the end of 2017. So I think we have to keep our eye on these folks. At least for the moment, they don't have the sanction of the U.S. Department of Justice. The last lesson I take from this period is that if you have a president who really wants to silence, deport, or jail his critics, the best thing he can have is a war. U.S. entry into World War I was the excuse for everything I'm talking about. I don't think it was the real motive for it. There were a lot of bottled up tensions in this country when the U.S. entered the war, but it was the excuse for it. So every time that President Trump talks about making threatening gestures, towards China, towards Iran, maybe towards North Korea again, he and Kim seem to be falling out of love at the moment. Keep a long-range eye on what he is maybe thinking about doing under cover of that war hysteria. I want to take one other example from this book, an example that involves taking lessons not just from the past, but from other places, and encouraging lessons. There are a couple of such pieces in the book, and here's what one of them is about. A few years ago, I was invited to a book festival in Finland. And when I got there, the publisher who'd invited me showed me the schedule of events for the week and said, look, here, you've got a free day on your schedule on Thursday. Is there anything you'd like us to arrange for you? We've got some beautiful medieval churches you might want to see. And I said, what I'd really like to see is a prison. And the reason for that is that I knew that Finland had one of the world's lowest incarceration rates. They lock people up at less than 10% of the rate we do here in the United States. Now, obviously, there are some differences between the two countries. It's smaller, it's colder, but that can't explain everything. So I spent most of the day in a medium security prison called Kerava. The prisoners were all men, although interestingly, the director of the prison and most of the staff were women. The men were there for a variety of offenses, some of them violent, violating drug laws, fraud, embezzlement, burglary, armed robbery. The thing that most struck me was that these prisoners were all day long in classes. Language classes, vocational skills classes, computer skills, a cooking class. I had a delicious meal that was prepared by the cooking class, first aid. And when they complete a particular class or a group of courses that certifies them for something, they get a diploma that is from a national education certification organization, the same thing that certifies such courses all around the country, that doesn't say you took this class in prison. It just says you are a licensed computer technician or whatever the skill is. They had an organic farm inside this prison. And as the director walked me through it, she explained how she felt that taking care of small animals was something very therapeutic, and she could see its effect on the prisoners. They had a library bigger than you would find in most American high schools. And if a prisoner was looking for a book that he couldn't find in the library, he could get it through the National Interlibrary Loan System. They had individual psychotherapy. They had group psychotherapy and Alcoholics Anonymous groups, a life skills class that met 3 times a week, and something they were very proud of, a series of lectures by former inmates from this prison who had been released, successfully readjusted to life in the outside world, and came back and talked about how they did it. Before a prisoner is released from Kerava prison, a social worker from the prison goes to the town that he's to be released to and makes sure he has a safe place to live and a job. Then he's released. Imagine how different that is from what we have in this country now. I don't need to fill in the details. Now, you can say, our way of doing things is so deeply embedded. You will never get, you can have various prison reform initiatives here, but, the Nordic way of doing things and our way of doing things are just so different that there is no hope of our ever having something, a criminal justice system that looks like this. But here's where it's interesting to look at the history. Because if you roll back the clock almost 70 years to the year 1950, in 1950, Finland locked people up at a rate greater than we did in the United States. In 1950 in Finland, 187 people out of every 100,000 were behind bars, as against only 175 here. And that's counting all those prisoners on chain gangs in the American South. A long series of reforms in Finland, not without their hardline opponents, brought this rate of incarceration way down, just as our own soared. Today, we have 655 people per 100,000 in prison in the United States, compared to 57 per 100,000 in Finland. So, my point is simply that a country can change something that seems very basic if it really wants to. So these are a couple of the topics I've covered in the book. Some others I don't have time to go into here, but maybe if we have some time for a little back and forth discussion, we can. One piece is about a fascinating figure in the world of intelligence, whom I call the father of American surveillance. Several of the pieces are about favorite authors of mine. Some of them I'm sure are familiar to you. Writers like George Orwell and Mark Twain. Others may not be. Writers like Sven Lindqvist and Victor Serge. A couple of the articles are about the experience of living half a year in India. The oldest piece in the book, from the year 1994, is about spending a day on the on the campaign trail with Nelson Mandela when he was running for president in South Africa's first free election. Several of the pieces are about more recently going back to Africa, to eastern Congo, to see what that part of the world looks like today. Some of you may have read my book, King Leopold's Ghost, which is about the Congo of more than 100 years ago. So those are some of the other things in the book. And despite the grim times that we're in, I want to end on a more positive note by reading you a very short piece that ends the book, and perhaps it's an appropriate thing to read, because it's a piece about books, and perhaps it's an appropriate thing to read here when we're in a sort of wonderful temple of books. So let me just read you the piece that ends the book here. For the first time, some American school and college students are being issued electronic books instead of printed textbooks. Their arrival feels to me not like technological progress, but like the first notes of a death knell. In a society in which relatively few people read books for pleasure to begin with, still fewer will do so if they do not encounter books, real books, as students. There are many reasons to love the old-fashioned paper book. That promising virginal crackle of the spine as you open a new hardcover for the first time. The sense of accomplishment as you look at the shelves of what you've read, and of humility as you look at the shelves of what you haven't. I've been feeling sad about the imperiled state of printed books for an additional reason. What books tell us about the person who loves them? In this way, books give a small measure of immortality not just to writers, but also to readers. Each year, my wife and I spend time in what was once the summer home of her late parents, and the room where I work is lined with her father's books. He was a career Foreign Service officer, a staunch Cold War liberal, and a man who believed that the best of human virtues were incarnated in Puritan New England. His picture of the United States was far rosier than mine. But whatever the limits of his worldview, what strikes me now is how much of it I can still see in the books on his shelves. They are a portrait of his mind. There are books about the various places where he served as a diplomat: Ghana, New Zealand, Israel, Tunisia. For each time he was sent to a new country, he read up on it enthusiastically, looking for upbeat parallels to the New England experience. There are books by the hundreds about the United States, for the most part portraying it as a country where everything works as wonderfully as the Founding Fathers planned. Their titles alone tell the tale. This Glorious Burden, Chance or Destiny, The First New Nation. This is the challenge, the discipline of power. Sometimes a slip of paper marks a passage he especially liked. Some of his books are from a phase when he read biographies and memoirs of the famous. No dissidents, no women, but many presidents, great writers, and Supreme Court justices. He was trying, he once told me, to figure out what were the early life experiences that made people into great men, a phrase he always pronounced as if both words were capitalized. Other volumes clearly represent less what he actually read than what he would have liked to have read, for books also form portraits of our unfulfilled ambitions. An ancient leather-bound set of Blackstone's Commentaries on the Laws of England, a huge family Bible, Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, and Emerson's complete works. None of them have the creased spines of books that have been frequently opened. Finally, there is his beloved collection of books on New England, including the 795-page Genealogical Dictionary of Maine and New Hampshire, which I pull out every summer to try to imagine the mysterious controversy alluded to in its preface. This acknowledges the contributions to the volume made by one Charles Thornton Libby, who, quote, acted as a consultant in problems in which he was known to have a personal interest, but his deep-seated conviction that the book should not be published at all did not make for an entirely happy situation, unquote. The point is this: I can look around the room and see a landscape of my father-in-law's passions, quirks, and beliefs. His 4 grandchildren, one born after his death, will be able to do this for years to come. Collections of books, large and small, transcend time. Sometimes it is just a shelf of books over a bed. How many times, as a guest in someone else's house, staying in the room of a son or daughter no longer at home, have I looked through a bookshelf for clues to the tastes and dreams of the person who once slept here? Such voyeurism is not a forbidden one, but one to be celebrated. It's not just the writing of books that expresses who we are, but also the freedom to collect them, to arrange them, and to enjoy the collections of others. Once a man was visiting our house who had recently been released from many years as a political prisoner in Pakistan. Sitting in our living room talking, at one point he paused, jumped up, and began running his hands over the books on our shelves. "You must excuse me," he apologized. "I have not been able to do this for years." So, thank you. So, I think we have a few minutes if...
We do. If you have
comment.
a question, please make your way to this microphone over there.
The microphone right there, yeah.
So since the 2016 election, looking for optimism, what signs of hope do you see and what guidance do you have for us?
I have all the answers. Yeah. Well, the biggest sign of hope I see is the 2018 election, which I think had some very encouraging results. One of which is that for the first time in many years, the percentage of Democrats in the House of Representatives is actually slightly higher than their percentage of the popular vote, which almost never used to happen because of gerrymandering. But there is some mysterious way I don't fully understand in which population shifts have undone some of that, and I hope court decisions will undo still more of that. I do think we have an enormous problem of voter suppression in this country, and there were some steps forward and some steps back on that in this last election. The big step forward, of course, was in Florida, where they, a popular referendum removed this ban on former felons from voting, and they estimate that'll enfranchise 1.4 million people. Not that all of them will vote. This is the other big problem we have to do, is to motivate people to turn out and vote. But I feel that whole problem of voter suppression has been put on the national agenda in a way that it wasn't quite before. And of course, one of the prime architects of that, Chris Kobach, got defeated in his race in Kansas. So these are some of the things I feel encouraged by, but we have a lot of work still to do. And I'm sure a lot of you were out there working in different congressional districts and other parts of the country where your efforts were needed last month and before, and more power to you, and you're going to have to do it again in 2020.
Hi. I'm in the middle of your wonderful book, Bury the Chains. I read King Leopold's Ghost. And the thing I love about this book is how you talk about Thomas Clarkson and how amazingly he helped spur the effort to end the triangle slave trade, and how nobody thought that could end because it was such an economic boon to so many empires. So in this country, I think we need a similar Thomas Clarkson to go up against the NRA. And I was also looking at this program last weekend by Fareed Zakaria about gun control in this country. And one of the things they talked about, a sort of similar person, was the Australian Prime Minister. I was trying to Google his name because I can't remember which one, who led the gun control laws in Australia, and ended up, people were threatening him. He had death threats, and he had to wear a bulletproof vest when he went around the country advocating for gun control. And they showed bulldozers, bulldozing the guns that people handed in. It was really a wonderful effort. In Australia, as a result, no longer has the mass shootings that spurred it. And so I think in this country, we need somebody that could be like a Thomas Clarkson or an Australian Prime Minister. I mean, the gun culture is so deep and so rooted here. Do you think it's ever going to be possible to change that?
Well, I think it's not going to be one person who magically does it. It's got to be a lot of people. The gun thing is a tough one. They did do it in Australia. And I think very often the reasons when sudden social change happens, and Australia passing these very strict gun laws is one example, and the book that you're reading, Bury the Chains, which is about the British anti-slavery movement of the late 1700s, early 1800s, is another example. Both of these, and the anti-slavery movement I know more about from having lived with those folks while writing this book, both of these are examples, I think, where the good folks got organized before the other side did. One of the fascinating things for me about the anti-slavery movement, which took off in such a dramatic way, so suddenly, in England in the late 1780s, is that the slaveholder lobby just didn't know what hit them. Slavery had been something that everybody took for granted. It had always been there, it seemed. The Romans had slaves. The Greeks had slaves. If we didn't have slavery, where would we get the sugar for our tea? There had been no movement. And then this extremely well-organized group of people got together, invented most of the tools that we use for political organizing today, from the political poster to the logo to the very idea of having a group agitating for something in a national capital with corresponding with committees in towns and cities around the country. This kind of thing hadn't been done before. And they were able to pull it off. We're going to have a harder time with guns in this country because the NRA is so well entrenched, and they've got the whole gun industry behind them. But in the course of writing about this, and there's one piece in the book that does deal with gun culture in America, one of the things I learned that I hadn't been so aware of before is the tremendous difference that there is between different states in this country and the degree to which they regulate guns, and correspondingly, the degree to which the number of shootings tends to be somewhat less. There are tremendous differences among the states, which encouraged me to think that we can move forward on that issue in a kind of piecemeal fashion. There are also remarkable differences, 3- and 4-fold differences between American states and the incarceration rate. Vermont and Rhode Island lock people up at less than a quarter the rate that they do in Louisiana or Mississippi. So I think there are things, often by starting at the state level that one can accomplish something.
Thank you.
You've been remarkably successful at picking topics that people want to read about. How do you go about selecting the topics for your book?
Well, it has to be something that obsesses me and that I find myself thinking about, wondering about for a long time. And then the job is trying to take my obsession and find a way of making it interesting to somebody who doesn't think they're obsessed with this thing to begin with. And for me, that's all about choosing characters through whom to tell a story. And I think of myself as like a film or theater director having auditions, except they're often auditions for parts which have not yet exactly been written, but I'm out looking for people. I'll take one book as an example that some of you may have read, and I think I did talk about it here. To End All Wars, which is my book about the First World War. I've long been obsessed with the First World War. I had 2 uncles who fought in it. My father actually was of military age during the First World War, wanted very much to get into the U.S. Army, was bitterly disappointed that he was turned down because he had bad eyesight. My mother, on the other hand, had a cousin she loved very much who was killed in the First World War, so there was always a lot of talk about the war in my family, and the older I got, the more I read about it, and the more fascinated I got by this period. And I found there were 2 aspects of it that fascinated me. One was the utter boneheaded stupidity of the generals on both sides who, day after day, year after year, ordered these poor young men to climb out of their trenches and not run, not crawl, but walk towards the enemy trench so that they could be mowed down by the millions by machine gun fire. How were these men thinking? Because these were their own sons they were sending into battle. The other type of person that had long fascinated me were the resistors, people like Eugene Debs and Emma Goldman in this country, Keir Hardie and Bertrand Russell in England, Jean Jaurès in France, who saw this war as madness as it was happening or as it was about to happen, and who spoke out against it loudly, clearly, often were sent to jail as a result. Now, my problem was these were sort of twin obsessions, but I couldn't figure out how to get these 2 very different types of people into the same book. And I read and read and read and collected characters, but they just wouldn't come together. And then one day I was reading a very boringly written scholarly article about a British pacifist named Charlotte Despard, who was an ardent opponent of the war, a staunch radical on every issue of the day, favored independence for India, independence for Ireland, was arrested 4 times in the battle for women's suffrage. And after the First World War began, she traveled up and down England saying this was a terrible thing, and her speeches were often broken up by rock-throwing mobs. She went to visit the families of conscientious objectors who were in prison and so on. And in one sentence in passing, the writer of this article said, naturally, Mrs. Despard's activities were deeply upsetting to her brother, and it gave his name, which I recognized as British Commander-in-Chief on the Western Front. So I've got my book. I then realized the way to do it was telling a story through divided families. So I went looking for a couple of other divided families also in England, and then the rule was that other characters were admitted to the cast if they were connected to one of these 3 divided families. And so, but it's a search. It takes a while, and sometimes a person or an event obsesses me for a long time, and it takes a long time before I can figure out how to get that obsession into book form. But it has to obsess me to start with. So maybe that's the answer to your question.
Thank you very much. I especially like feel like I learned a lot from your several minutes of describing the World War I and post-war period, and how bad things were there in terms of xenophobia and other kind of similar, I guess you could say, right-leaning. So I'm interested in looking further at what the parallels are and what any lack of parallels are between the two. And in particular, is there a central figure from that time, a central political figure that in any sense would represent the Donald Trump of today? It doesn't seem to me that Woodrow Wilson would fill that particularly. As you say, there, in addition to the xenophobia, there was, in his case, League of Nations and a lot of sort of idealistic thought about nations getting along and so forth. And that doesn't really sound like Donald Trump.
Right.
So, what was driving this? Was it simply partisan warfare, or was there 1 or 2 or 3 central demagogues who were stoking this? You've kind of alluded to a few, but
well, what was driving the repression of that period? Again, we're talking about the 1917-1920 period. Wilson was a complicated figure because he did preside over and stamped his approval on a lot of that repression. At the same time, there was a genuinely idealistic streak in what he was trying to do with the League of Nations. And particularly in the first years of his presidency and before he became president, he took some fairly strong positions against unbridled corporate power and so on. He was never somebody who had much use for immigrants, though. And even if you look at his early writing, there's a book he wrote that came out in 1902 when he was still a professor at Princeton, just before he became president of Princeton, where he talks about how the good Anglo-Saxon stock of this country is being brought down by this terrible new wave of immigrants from Eastern Europe and Southern Europe. In other words, Jews and Italians. So that was a pretty strong element of his thinking all along. I think there were a lot of mini demagogues, mini Trumps, all through that period. One person in particular, well, several people in and around Wilson. One was his Attorney General, A. Mitchell Palmer, who presided over these so-called Palmer raids, where thousands of radicals were rounded up. Palmer had been understandably jarred because anarchists tried to blow up his house, and didn't. The only person who got killed was one of the anarchists who managed to blow himself up. And I think that may have made Palmer more militant than he had been to start with. J. Edgar Hoover was really his number 2 person during those raids, and Hoover certainly saw this kind of crackdown as a way to make his own career. And throughout the rest of his life in government, Hoover was far more interested in cracking down on communists, anarchists, and other radicals than he was on organized crime, for instance. Another one of the mini-Trumps of that period was the Postmaster General, Sidney Albert Burleson, the first Texan to be in a cabinet, whose father had fought for the Confederacy and who was the person who presided over this crackdown on the media. So, there were a lot of unsavory people there. But what strikes me most when I read about this time is that, and try to imagine myself in it, and there are actually some things you can actually see some film footage, of these Palmer raids, policemen and federal agents barging into houses and throwing people down staircases and doing stuff like that. What strikes me is that and I fear that there always is, but there was a lot of it that was visible then. There is a lot of bottled up nastiness in all of us that when there's an excuse for it to come out, and there's no excuse like the country going to war, it comes out in these very nasty ways. And you read the accounts of Wilson, for instance, going to Congress to ask for a declaration of war in the spring of 1917. There were some brave dissenters. There were 6 senators who voted against the declaration of war. One of them was the great progressive Robert La Follette, who stood there on the Senate floor chewing gum with his arms crossed like this when Wilson was giving his speech. And he began receiving nooses in the mail. But you read the accounts of other members of Congress, and there were people with tears of joy streaming down their faces. The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, I cannot remember who that was at that, or one of the Supreme Court justices was actually a Confederate veteran who was crying with joy that now his country was at war, in a war that he could support. There's a lot of bottled up fury in a lot of us that needs a place to go. And a well-orchestrated war can sort of provide a vent for that. What was driving these vigilantes who, tarred and feathered draft resistors? What was driving when American soldiers went to France to fight in this war? The U.S. Army had a problem unlike any other army in the First World War had, which was that they had a problem of what they called soldiers deserting to the front, people who were assigned to rear areas, as most soldiers are in most wars, because you have long supply lines and, warehouses and ships to be unloaded and so on, would grab a gun and run away to the front because they wanted to kill Germans. Where does that kind of furious enthusiasm come from? I'm not sure, but I think there's a vast potential of it at all times and places, and effective demagogues know how to speak to it and unleash it.
Hi, thanks for speaking. My question comes both from the title of your book and from the earlier question about the NRA. The cloud that's over all of our heads in this dark time is climate change.
Yes.
And this may be an unfair question, haven't read the book, but do the lessons from past shed any light on how we make faster progress against a problem like climate change, where, like your comment with the NRA, it's really going to need a bottoms-up, grassroots revolt of sorts But so far on climate change, it's not happening. It's not happening fast enough.
Right.
So I wonder if there are any lessons that you might comment in that area.
It's a tough one because it is the big problem facing us all, overwhelming in its consequences. And it's hard to think of another time in history when the most powerful person in the most powerful country in the world was in flat, outright denial of the major problem of the day. I think part of it is a question of finding ways to speak about this which will resonate with people. I don't know what the answer is on that, but I'll just tell you an interesting story. The woman who asked a question a moment ago said she was reading my book about the anti-slavery movement, Bury the Chains. And this was a movement where, as I said, it was born in England with astonishing swiftness. It took off, and in the space of about half a dozen years, you had 400,000 people in Britain, which was more people than were eligible to vote at that time, signing petitions to Parliament against the slave trade, 300,000 people refusing to eat slave-grown sugar from the Caribbean, and this popular movement remained in force and managed to get the British slave trade stopped after 20 years of organizing, and then end slavery in the British Empire 25 years before it was ended here in the United States. Now, and I think they did it through devising new means of organizing, new means of dramatizing their message. I don't know exactly what the analogous ones are today for climate change, but that's one of the reasons why I like looking at history, because sometimes you can see the lessons a little more clearly when you're looking way back in time. One of the things they found, for example, was this, that up to the late 1780s, there had been a certain amount of debate in the press and in political pamphlets and so on, and occasionally on the floor of Parliament about slavery and the slave trade, but it had all been carried on in terms of biblical argument. This was a very religious age, and of course in the Bible you can find arguments for and against slavery the way you can find arguments for and against almost anything else. What these folks discovered was the enormous power of eyewitness testimony. That if you could find people who had worked on slave plantations, freed slave who came to England and was willing to tell his story, a former slave ship captain who repented of what he'd done, tell his story, these books and pamphlets had wide circulation, far more than before. So they discovered new ways of telling the story. For the first few years after that book was published, whenever somebody would ask me to come and speak about it somewhere, it was usually, a college course on slavery and the slave trade, or an African history course, or something like that. The last half dozen times I've been asked to speak about this book, it's all from groups working on climate change. Sierra Club, 350.org, Union of Concerned Scientists, a religious group, just gave a talk a couple of weeks ago to another group. They're trying to figure out, and we all need to figure out, what are the analogous new ways of speaking that we need to adopt in order to get through to people on the urgency of the danger that we're facing there. I don't know what they are, but I think it behooves us all to be trying to figure that one out. That's the big one.
Adam, you want to sign some books?
Sure. Okay.
Thank you very much. Copies of